The woman sitting in the uncomfortable oak chair in the third municipal courtroom of the district was exactly 30 seconds away from becoming a billionaire, and the man laughing at her from across the aisle was exactly 30 seconds away from utter financial execution. Sterling Cross adjusted the cuffs of his $10,000 bespoke silk suit and leaned back in his leather chair with a smile that dripped with pure, unadulterated venom. He sneered at the plain, off-the-rack gray blazer worn by his ex-wife, Evelyn Vance, treating her very presence like a disgusting stain on his perfect morning. Next to him, his new fiancée, Vanessa Trent, twisted a massive 3-carat diamond ring on her perfectly manicured finger, whispering something in Sterling's ear that made them both erupt into cruel, snickering laughter. The courtroom air was thick with the suffocating arrogance of a man who firmly believed he had outsmarted the entire universe. Sterling had spent the last 14 brutal months systematically destroying Evelyn's credit, draining their joint accounts, and flaunting his sudden meteoric tech wealth across every social media platform imaginable. He wanted her completely ruined. He wanted her begging on the street. He wanted to watch her walk out of this downtown courthouse with absolutely nothing but the crushing, devastating weight of his discarded, manufactured debts. Evelyn did not cry. She did not yell. She did not even clench her jaw. She sat completely motionless, her spine perfectly straight, her breathing rhythmic and shallow, like a highly trained sniper waiting for the exact microscopic shift in the wind. Her bare hands were folded, resting lightly on the scarred wooden table in front of her. She did not wear a single piece of jewelry. Her pale face was a flawless mask of terrifying, unblinking stoicism. Sterling mistook her absolute silence for absolute defeat. He leaned across the heavy oak table, pointing a manicured finger directly at her face, his voice loudly echoing through the high, vaulted ceiling of the courtroom as he cruelly mocked her cheap, scuffed shoes and her supposed impending eviction. He boasted loudly enough for the exhausted court reporter to physically wince that he was a brilliant, self-made titan of industry, and that Evelyn was a worthless parasite who deserved to be violently scraped off the bottom of his custom Italian leather loafers. Every vicious insult he hurled into the heavy courtroom air was just another rusty nail he eagerly drove into his own miserable coffin. Evelyn simply watched him. She watched the arrogant pulse jumping in his thick neck. She watched the smug flare of his nostrils and the greedy glint in his dark eyes. She knew something he did not. She knew that the loudest man in the room is always the easiest to mathematically slaughter. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut, sealing the tension inside as Sterling's high-priced defense attorney Donovan Hayes strutted to the center of the floor with the slick, oily confidence of a snake oil salesman holding a winning lottery ticket. Hayes slapped a thick, leather-bound dossier onto the bench right in front of the Honorable Judge Marcus Thorne, proudly declaring that the marital estate of Sterling Cross was completely and utterly bankrupt. Hayes meticulously detailed how Sterling's supposedly booming tech empire had tragically collapsed under catastrophic hidden debt, forcing him to liquidate 100% of his lucrative patents, proprietary software, and operating cash. He explained with a theatrical sigh that every last dime had been legally sold off for pennies in the dollar to a massive, independent offshore entity known as Omnicorp Holdings, simply to appease ruthless foreign creditors. According to the flawless, legally binding documents spread across the polished mahogany bench, Sterling was mathematically destitute, possessing a net worth of absolute zero, and therefore Evelyn was entitled to exactly half of nothing. Judge Thorne adjusted his reading glasses, his face pulling into a tight grimace of profound frustration as his exhausted eyes scanned the intricate, ironclad corporate filings. The judge hated it, but the paperwork was a masterpiece of ruthless legal evasion, leaving him absolutely no judicial loophole to exploit or manipulate. The courtroom fell into a sickening, heavy silence as the judge slowly reached for his wooden gavel, deeply burdened by the strict letter of the law that was about to enforce a horrific, devastating injustice. Sterling leaned over the defense table and deliberately bumped his shoulder against Vanessa, who let out a sharp, high-pitched giggle that echoed painfully off the cold stone walls. Sterling turned his heavy head to stare directly into Evelyn's eyes, flashing a monstrous, greedy smile, while silently mouthing the word "loser" across the agonizingly quiet room. He firmly believed he had done it. He believed he had successfully starved her out, legally stripped her of her rightful half of a $90 million empire, and chained her to a miserable future of crushing poverty, while he secretly held the untraceable keys to his hidden offshore kingdom. The air in the room felt toxic, thick with the suffocating, nauseating reality that the arrogant villain had actually won the war. But Evelyn simply blinked, her heart rate resting at a cool, perfectly steady 60 beats per minute, as she gave her own lawyer a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. The heavy wooden gavel hovered exactly 2 inches above the sound block when Evelyn's attorney finally stood up, slicing through the toxic courtroom silence with a voice like cracking ice. He did not object or argue. He simply stepped forward and slid a single, heavy, gold-embossed corporate ledger across the smooth, polished mahogany surface of the judge's bench. The attorney calmly announced that the defense had indeed provided completely accurate records regarding the total liquidation of Sterling's massive corporate assets to Omnicorp Holdings, but they had conveniently failed to disclose the true, verifiable chain of ownership behind that impenetrable offshore shell corporation. From the shadows of the back row of the gallery, a tall, quiet man named Julian Vance stepped forward, moving with the chilling, detached precision of a high-level corporate architect. Julian did not look at the arrogant Sterling, and he completely ignored the sneering Vanessa, simply approaching the clerk to present a pristine stack of authenticated international corporate seals, biometric security logs, and binding shareholder registry documents. Julian was not a savior arriving with a checkbook. He was the silent, tactical proxy, the invisible operator running the complex financial network that Evelyn had brilliantly masterminded and weaponized months before the divorce was ever even filed. Judge Thorne opened the heavy gold ledger, and his breathing hitched, his eyes instantly widening behind his thick reading glasses as he processed the absolute, undeniable, legally binding checkmate permanently printed on the very first page. Omnicorp Holdings was not a random consortium of ruthless foreign creditors demanding immediate repayment. It was a highly secure, private, closed corporation, and the anonymous majority shareholder, holding exactly 80% of the controlling voting rights and total executive veto power, was Evelyn Vance. The suffocating tension in the massive room snapped violently like a high-voltage wire as the horrific, flawless mechanics of the trap finally slammed into place. In his ravenous, blind greed, Sterling had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in elite legal fees to draft the ultimate asset protection scheme, gleefully signing away his entire $90 million tech empire, his lucrative proprietary software patents, and every single drop of his liquid operating cash, just to desperately hide it all from the final divorce settlement. He honestly believed he was brilliantly burying his massive fortune in an untouchable, invisible offshore vault. But he had never realized that his quiet, unassuming wife had actually built the very vault he was using. By executing his own malicious strategy, Sterling had willingly, legally, and permanently gifted his entire life's work directly into Evelyn's private corporate portfolio, without her ever having to ask for a single penny. The blood drained from Sterling's face so rapidly, he looked as though he had just been injected with liquid nitrogen. The arrogant, cruel smirk that had been permanently plastered across his features for the last 14 months disintegrated in a single, agonizing, microscopic second, replaced by a grotesque mask of sheer, suffocating terror. A violent, involuntary twitch erupted deep in the muscle of his left eyelid. His bespoke silk collar suddenly felt like a hangman's noose, choking him, as his chest heaved with sudden, jagged, shallow gasps. Cold, terrified sweat instantly broke out across his forehead, dripping down his temples and staining his incredibly expensive shirt. He stared at the gold-embossed ledger, sitting securely on the judge's bench, his heavy jaw hanging completely slack, his mouth opening and closing like a dying fish suffocating on dry land. He tried desperately to speak, to object, to scream, but the words violently caught in his constricting throat, coming out as nothing more than a pathetic, wet wheeze. Beside him, Vanessa physically recoiled, ripping her hand away from his arm, as if his suit had suddenly burst into scalding flames, her vapid expression twisting into ugly confusion and mounting horror as she realized the money was instantly gone. But the most spectacular and devastating breakdown belonged entirely to his high-priced shark of an attorney, Donovan Hayes. Hayes practically tore the authenticated documents from the court clerk's hands, his frantic eyes darting wildly across the biometric security logs, the corporate seals, and the ironclad chain of title. The slick, oily confidence of the defense attorney evaporated into pure, unadulterated animal panic as the catastrophic legal reality aggressively crushed his chest. Hayes was a ruthless legal expert, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. By willingly facilitating this massive transfer of liquid assets to an offshore holding company without disclosing its true nature to the court, he was now directly implicated in a multi-million-dollar conspiracy to commit federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and felony perjury. If he went down with this rapidly sinking ship, he would be instantly and permanently disbarred before being thrown into a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. Pure, visceral survival instinct instantly overrode every single ounce of attorney-client privilege. Hayes violently shoved his heavy oak chair backward, the wood screeching horribly against the polished marble floor, echoing like a gunshot. He threw both of his hands into the air, completely abandoning the arrogant man who had just paid him a fortune. His voice cracked with sheer, high-pitched desperation as he shouted into the official court microphone, aggressively pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Sterling's chest. Hayes yelled frantically to the judge that he had been completely and maliciously lied to, that his dangerous client had orchestrated this entire fraudulent offshore asset strip in total secrecy, and that he formally demanded to be immediately withdrawn as defense counsel so he could cooperate fully with any pending federal criminal investigations. Sterling snapped his neck toward his own lawyer, his dark eyes bulging with wild, feral disbelief, as the very man he had hired to destroy his ex-wife, publicly and ruthlessly threw him under the heaviest bus imaginable, right onto the permanent, unsealed, official court record. The courtroom transformed into a chamber of absolute legal execution, as Judge Marcus Thorne slammed his heavy wooden gavel down 3 times with a sound that rattled the bulletproof glass windows. The judge rose fully to his feet, his black robes billowing as he leaned over the high bench, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson, while his eyes burned with an unforgiving, righteous fury. He pointed his finger directly at the trembling, sweating Sterling, commanding the court bailiffs to immediately secure the exit doors and block anyone from leaving the room. Judge Thorne's voice boomed through the microphone, echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a localized thunderstorm, as he stated for the official record that in his 32 years on the municipal bench, he had never witnessed an act of such malicious, arrogant, and criminal bad faith. The judge completely bypassed the standard asset division process entirely, declaring that because Sterling had intentionally and fraudulently transferred the entirety of his corporate holdings to Omnicorp Holdings to evade the court, those assets were now legally bound by the corporate ownership structure, meaning Evelyn possessed exclusive, undisputed control over 100% of the tech empire, the patents, and the cash. But the judge was far from finished. He looked down at the rapidly hyperventilating Sterling and declared that by executing those fraudulent transfers under the guise of an offshore debt liquidation, Sterling had triggered immediate and massive personal capital gains tax liabilities and severe statutory penalties that remained tied strictly to his individual name. Judge Thorne officially ordered the immediate total freezing of every single one of Sterling's personal bank accounts, credit lines, investment portfolios, and real estate deeds to secure those massive debts to the state. The judge then instructed the court reporter to immediately flag the official transcript for the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, explicitly calling for Sterling's immediate arrest and indictment for criminal perjury and wire fraud. Vanessa looked at Sterling, her face contorted in absolute disgust and horror as she realized that the multimillionaire she had actively helped steal from his wife was now hundreds of millions of dollars in debt, facing a lengthy mandatory sentence in a federal maximum security prison. She did not say a single word of comfort. She simply grabbed her expensive designer purse, ripped the massive 3-carat diamond ring off her finger, throwing it directly onto the table, before turning her back on him completely and storming out through the side exit, like he was a contagious disease. Sterling slumped forward into his leather chair, his forehead hitting the cold, scarred wood of the table, his entire body shaking violently as he wept muffled, pathetic tears of pure, helpless ruin, realizing that his own greedy trap had functioned perfectly as his very own public executioner. Evelyn Vance calmly stood up from her chair, her movements fluid, smooth, and utterly unbothered by the absolute destruction echoing through the room. She did not cast a single glance at the sobbing, broken shell of a man buried face down in his own useless paperwork, nor did she look back at the discarded diamond ring rolling pathetically across the floor. She picked up her simple leather briefcase, snapping the brass latches closed with a crisp, definitive metallic click that sounded exactly like the closing of a tomb. As she stepped away from the table, her new strategic partner, Julian Vance, opened the heavy oak gallery doors for her, standing as a silent, powerful testament to the massive global corporate empire they now officially controlled together. Right at the threshold, Evelyn paused for a fraction of a second, turning her head just enough to allow her icy, unblinking gaze to fall onto Sterling's trembling, hunched shoulders. Her voice was incredibly quiet, yet it sliced completely through the muffled sounds of his panic attacks and the frantic murmurs of the court bailiffs as she delivered her final, devastating verdict, stating simply that he should have remembered that he only ever ran the company, while she was the one who actually built it. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked through the heavy double doors, stepping out into the bright, crisp morning sunlight, completely free, incredibly powerful, and fundamentally untouchable, while the legal wolves behind her closed in on her ruined ex-husband. If you love seeing arrogant greed completely exposed and absolute karma served perfectly cold, hit that like button right now to help the algorithm punish more villains. Subscribe to the channel for more gripping, high-stakes courtroom dramas, and drop a comment below with your thoughts on how perfectly this trap was executed. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next shocking story.